My starting point for this paper on Scottish nature writing is a quotation from the writer-environmentalist George Monbiot. Nature appealed to our hearts when we were children, long before it appealed to our heads. The fundamental importance of our connection to the natural world has been explored by both artists and scientists. In the modern world, the concept of biophilia was first outlined by the psychologist Erich Fromm and later popularised by biologist Edward Wilson in his book of the same name. The concept centres on the idea that each human being is born with, quote, the urge to affiliate with other forms of life. Being attracted to all that is alive and vital, to everything that pulses with the same life force we can feel within ourselves, lies at the centre of what it is to be human. Furthermore, there is a special relationship between young humans and the natural world. Richard Louv, in his best-selling book from 2009, Last Child in the Woods, makes a compelling case for compulsory and regular immersion in nature for our children. He coined the phrase nature deficit disorder in order to express the damaging effects on a child's emotions and behaviour when their experience of the natural world is minimal. He writes passionately about the benefits bestowed by the natural world. He says, in nature, a child finds freedom, fantasy, and privacy, a place distant from the adult world, a separate piece. In contrast to the digital age's fixation with being connected 24/7, Louv and others stress the importance of solitude and sensory exploration in natural environments. As the Romantic poets knew, contemplative time spent alone in nature has a profound and lasting influence on personality and identity. The years between the ages of 5 and 18 are arguably the most crucial in terms of growing and developing a sense of self. Over the same time period, forest schools, the John Muir Award, Duke of Edinburgh expeditions, and other similar endeavours are all vitally important in fostering this connection with nature in our young people. What place might literature take? Interestingly, Richard Louv explains how books operate in the same way as the natural world for the child. Reading, too, is an activity in which the child finds precious freedom, fantasy, and privacy away from the adult world. However, this is not to suggest some sort of Arcadia to which children can return, either through direct experience of the outdoors or through reading. Our pupils are becoming young adults in the so-called Anthropocene, the epoch in which humankind has caused mass extinctions of plant and animal species, turned the oceans into plastic broth, and altered the atmosphere, with potentially catastrophic consequences. The current rate of environmental destruction and change is so high, today's 14-year-old may remember seeing Atlantic puffins on a holiday in the Orkneys, but when they return with their own child in 15 years' time, it's likely that the puffins will have vanished. Our young people will have a relationship with nature which will have to be continually remade. The anger and urgency which typifies the youth environmental movement, epitomised by Greta Thunberg, is entirely justified. In his important article in the New Statesman in 2015, Robert Mcfarlane wrote, and I quote, "A 21st century culture of nature has sprung up, born of anxiety and anger, but passionate and progressive in its temperament, involving millions of people and spilling across forms, media and behaviours." In attempting to set out the values of this new culture of nature, Mcfarlane identifies 3 major strands which seem to be values which have often been attributed to Scottish social ethics: community over commodity, modesty over mastery, and connection over consumption. We can see these at work in Scottish cultural norms, although of course many of these are romantic ideals rather than facts of life. Scotland is generally seen to be politically inclined towards social democracy and inherently egalitarian. This can be seen in the thriving community land ownership movement, for example, which Alistair McIntosh documents in his important book, Soil and Soul, People versus Corporate Power. The Scots also like to think of themselves as diverse and inclusive. In recent years, the country has welcomed refugees when other nations spurned them. This is clearly an oversimplification, and much has already been written elsewhere about the complex realities of Scottish society, both present and past, in which we are not all Jock Tamson's bairns. However, when making a case for a particularly Scottish genre of nature writing, I intend to demonstrate that it is helpful to view much of the literature as emerging from a culture which values community and connection, egalitarianism, and the economy of enough. In this way, it is possible to see Scottish writers offering a particular view of nature and ourselves which correlates to deep ecology. Deep ecology, the phrase and concept, was introduced in 1973 by the Norwegian philosopher and mountaineer Arne Næss. In brief, deep ecology developed into both a philosophy and a grassroots movement which questions our purposes and values when we are grappling with environmental conflicts. It demands that the issues are debated right down to fundamental root causes. In contrast, the shallow approach stops short of fundamental change and often promotes technological short-term fixes such as recycling or increased engine efficiency in cars. In shallow ecology, the solutions are based on the same consumption-driven values of the industrial economy. The long-range, deep approach involves redesigning entire systems based on values which actually sustain the ecological and cultural diversity of the natural environment. I wish to suggest that Scottish writers who have turned their attention to the natural world and our place within it have engaged with nature in a profound way which honours connection. When they write about the Scottish landscape, they can offer answers to fundamentally important questions about ourselves and our planet. I also wish to suggest that Scottish nature writing can engage or re-engage our young people with the natural world, surely one of the most important and urgent projects of our time. Robert Mcfarlane makes clear the crucial connection between nature and literature when he reports that whenever he questions conservation scientists about how their passion for ecology began, it usually originates in an encounter with a wild creature and something they read when they were young. Furthermore, non-fiction texts of any genre can often engage even the most reluctant students of English. I would like to quote at some length from John Lawson's LTS resource, Critical Evaluation of Non-Fiction, in which the benefits of teaching non-fiction are neatly outlined. Study of a variety of non-fiction will expose students to a range of issues, informing them, challenging preconceptions, raising awareness, making them think. Of course, the same claims can be made for reading fiction, so how is non-fiction different? Essentially, it is in its actuality. By definition, it is not made up. It doesn't ask us to suspend our disbelief. In fact, it frequently demands that we don't suspend our belief. Its power is in the understanding of the reader that this has actually happened, or is actually happening, and that we can't dismiss it as only a story. And so to a brief outline of the nature writing tradition in England and the US, in order to situate the unique contributions of Scottish writers. It's out with the scope of this paper to offer more than the briefest history of nature writing, in order to provide some contextualisation for Scottish texts and authors. However, it's my hope that this cursory fly past will at least give you some starting points and ideas for further reading and researching. The Hampshire parson naturalist, Gilbert White, is usually credited with being the first ecologist. White's collection of observations of the wildlife around him, called The Natural History of Selborne, was published in 1789. It is a revolutionary text in its own gentle way. It bears little or no resemblance to previous publications about nature, which were concerned either with classification or how useful nature could be to humans. Instead, White recorded and delighted in animal behaviour for its own sake. His legacy can be traced through John James Audubon, Charles Darwin, and Richard Jefferies. Other canonical names include Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, and Rachel Carson. However, the late 20th century saw an incredible boom in the number of nature writing publications, which continues apace today. Richard Mabey, Roger Deakin, Robert Mcfarlane, Helen Macdonald, and Mark Cocker are perhaps the most significant and prolific writers of recent years. Mabey's book, The Nature Cure, published in 2005, broke the mould of 20th century nature writing, which had shaped the ostensibly scientific approach of most writers until this point. It tells the story of Mabey's struggle with depression and his recovery from it, which he accords to the restorative power of his beloved Chiltern Hills and Woods. Mabey's book was the first to comprehensively and consciously weave nature and writer together, creating a new genre of confessional prose. Its precedent is American, Thoreau's Walden. Its legacy can be traced through texts such as Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, in which she processes her grief for her father via her relationship with a goshawk, or Chris Packham's Fingers in the Sparkle Jar, an autobiography centred on his experiences as a young autistic person passionately in love with the natural world. Most recently, Amy Liptrott's The Outrun records her recovery from addiction on her family's Orcadian farm and its neighbouring wilderness. David Robinson, in his article Mapping Scotland's New Nature Writing, writes about the contemporary shift from the 20th century objective impulse to the 21st century subjective one. On the subject of Gavin Maxwell, for example, Robinson writes, "Back then, in the 1950s, nature was a fusion of enchanted lyricism and descriptive accuracy, nothing at all to do with the writer's psyche. Whatever other qualities British nature writing used to have 4 decades ago, openness and self-disclosure were not among them." Before I move on to the specifically Scottish tradition of nature writing, I'd like to share a perfect little anecdote given by Robert Mcfarlane to illustrate this stream of nature writing, which has traditionally been in culvert in 20th century British texts, but which has always bubbled vigorously through its American counterparts. For Thoreau, the importance of the first-person voice was so great that the printer who typeset the first edition of Walden ran out of capital I's. This subgenre of nature confessional is now incredibly popular, a fact which will strike us as being incredibly apposite in these times of ecological anxiety. Yet it is also incredibly ironic. More and more of us are reading about the healing which can occur from a deep connection between person and place, or person and animal, as these places and creatures are increasingly vulnerable and out of reach. When we come to study nature writing in Scotland, we will see both the lyrical accuracy mode and the confessional mode, and often in the same work. Scottish writers have written about landscape and wildlife in a multitude of ways. My own research interest is in the novels of the 1920s and 30s, looking specifically at how the Scottish novel of development, or Bildungsroman, explored the influences which shape personal identity. These include factors such as religion, education and sexuality, but in many of the novels of that time, there is a deep concern with Scotland's environment and its profound effect on the growing self. Catherine Carzole's heroine in Open the Door finds strength and solace in the Perthshire Hills. The story of Finn in Neil Gunn's Highland River explicitly connects personal growth with a journey to find the source of a river. And of course, there is Chris Guthrie's symbiotic relationship with the land in A Scots Quair. Of course, these are works of fiction, and I will talk about the benefits of reading nature-themed poetry and prose fiction with pupils. However, the focus here is on non-fiction, and for that reason I would like to turn to an examination of Nan Shepherd's acclaimed work, The Living Mountain. I propose to use this text as a tool to understand some of the features of a particularly Scottish kind of nature writing, and also to give you some starting points for how you might teach this text or other texts in your classes. Shepherd wrote The Living Mountain over several years, finishing the first draft just after the Second World War, but it was not published until 1977. It is a remarkable book which combines so many of the best elements of nature writing. Robert Mcfarlane, something of a champion of Shepherd's, has called it a, quote, slender masterpiece, a work which possesses a compressive intensity, a generic disobedience, a flaring prose poetry, and that it is full of life, death, body, gusto, touch, and, subtly, sexuality. Just as Shepherd, like John Muir, found that going out was really going in, so too the act of writing The Living Mountain was a private escape to the nature in and of her mind. Rather like children finding freedom, fantasy and privacy in books and in the wild, away from the adult world, Nan Shepherd seemed to find solace and wisdom away from the horror and madness of the Second World War in her hill-walking memories. Writing about her beloved Cairngorms was, as she put it, her secret place of ease. Stepping out of and away from society has enabled many to find their own personal truth. This is a long and powerful tradition, which includes but also predates Romanticism, extending as far back as the Desert Fathers. The Living Mountain is a panegyric to the rock, water, light and organisms of the Cairngorms. If that sounds rather scientific, much of it is, Shepherd writes in the language of the geologist, the botanist, the zoologist and the meteorologist. Yet the precisely recorded scientific observation is balanced with rich poetic description. Shepherd layers adjectives with an obvious delight in language and the diversity of her subject. There is personal experience or memory, often including an epiphany. There is philosophical, spiritual and psychological discourse. She takes the imagery of the body and applies it to the landscape, while simultaneously describing the sensual delight she experiences while walking or swimming or drifting off into sleep on the mountainside. Most chapters begin with a scientific description of the plateau or the recesses, but in others she begins with a personal anecdote. In chapter 8, for example, she introduces a section on birds with a memory of seeing swifts high up on a precipice. This experience was particularly vivid and meaningful for her. That first sight of the mad, joyous abandon of the swifts over and over the very edge of the precipice shocked me with a thrill of elation. Their headlong rush, each curve of which is at the same time a miracle of grace, the swishing sound of their cleavage of the air, and the occasional high-pitched cry, that is hardly like the note of an earthly bird, seemed to make visible and audible some essence of the free, wild spirit of the mountain. Perhaps even more impressive is the way in which Shepherd can make much less dynamic life forms equally thrilling. Here she is on the subject of a rare alpine flower. Granite cannot meet the needs of many of the rare mountain flowers that crave the streaks of limestone or the rich humus of the mica schist. Like that rarest of all, found only in one spot in the Cairngorms, the alpine milk vetch, its delicate pale bloom edged with lavender, haunted by its red and black familiar, the burnet moth. Why so haunted, no one knows, but no milk vetch, no burnet moth. Some of Shepherd's most beautiful prose in The Living Mountain comes when she is describing the light or the weather conditions or the air of the mountains, using the language of vitality and dynamism to convey the essential nature of phenomena which seem unalive to the ordinary observer. She writes, I watched from the shoulder of Maroon the Cairngorm mass eddy and sink and rise as it seemed like a tossed wreck on a yellow sea. Sky and the rack of precipice and overhang were confounded together. Now a spar, now a mast, just recognisable as buttress or cornice, tossed for a moment in the boiling sea of cloud. Ashen and yellow, the sky kicked convulsively. My final little extract for now displays her flair for describing colour. As soon as we see them clothed in air, the hills become blue. Every shade of blue, from opalescent milky white to indigo, is there. They are most opulently blue when rain is in the air. Then the gullies are violet. Gentian and delphinium hues with fire in them lurk in the folds. The violet range of colours can trouble the mind like music. As with so many parts of this wonderful book, Shepherd skillfully merges plain fact with prosody and euphony. She attends to the lyrical as well as the scientific, and although there are few overtly autobiographical aspects in this book, she subtly includes personal experience and memory in order to explore one of her central concerns, the fusion between human and mountain. Shepherd sees both herself and the mountain as being in possession of an intelligent body, both animated by a common life force. Excuse me. The final chapter of The Living Mountain reveals Shepherd's Buddhist leanings, an interest she shared with her friend and mentor, Neil Gunn. On her relationship with the mountain, she writes that, I am a manifestation of its total life, as is the starry saxifrage or the white-winged ptarmigan. Understanding can only be partially served by science. She writes, knowing another is endless. The thing to be known grows with the growing. Not for her, the triumphant conquering of summits and Monroe bagging. Shepherd's journey is explicitly into the mountain, not up it. This is anti-mountaineering, a slow philosophical exploration of the landscape's moods and subtleties, a dialogue between two beings who ultimately realise they are one. I'm reminded of Mcfarlane's list of characteristics of 21st century nature writing: modesty over mastery and connection over consumption. Nan Shepherd was living and writing these values 80 years ago. The Living Mountain is not an easy read. It is dense and opaque at times, and is almost bare of any kind of narrative with which to hook young adult readers. I've only ever taught it at advanced higher level, and I found that I had to fill in so many blanks in my pupils' knowledge of Scottish geography and wildlife before we could even begin to consider Shepherd's themes and style. Yet in its very difficulties lie the reasons it's worth teaching. Contemporary environmentalists talk of the importance of preserving children's knowledge of the natural world, since people do not protect things they do not value, and people do not value something they know nothing about. So if you have to give the pupils field guides alongside the Living Mountain, so much the better. If you can liaise with your geography department, wonderful. And if you can engage the pupils with this challenging, poetic and intellectual book, you will have done your pupils an enormous favour. To quote Robert Mcfarlane again, powerful writing can revise our ethical relations with the natural world, shaping our place consciousness and our place conscience. So how can this important dynamic genre shape what we do in the classroom? As teachers, I know that we like to get as much out of a resource or topic as possible. Studying nature writing offers wonderful opportunities not only for the critical evaluation of texts and plenty of reading for UAE papers. It also allows a way in for pupils when they are producing their own personal reflective writing. The question of the individual's relationship with their environment lies at the heart of the most significant tension in nature writing, the tension between writing about nature and writing through nature. One of the big names I have already mentioned, Mark Cocker, has criticised the wholeheartedly subjective approach adopted by many of the recent stars of the genre. He calls the writing of Helen Macdonald and others like her, quote, a literature of consolation, a distraction from the truth of our fallen countryside. Cocker is critical of the new nature writing because he feels that it lacks the urgent political, environmental impulse to raise awareness and persuade more people to take practical action. For Cocker, new nature writing looks inward while the fields literally burn. These issues provide fertile ground for discussion, particularly at higher or advanced higher level, and can help pupils elevate their writing from merely personal to personal reflective. Even the best young writers struggle to make their own experiences relevant in a wider sense. By having opportunities to read non-fiction and discuss issues of subjectivity, self-disclosure, shared experience, and writing as a force for change, pupils can make that crucial leap from the purely subjective mode. Furthermore, as English teachers, we are often privy to the real-life troubles and worries of our pupils when we receive those personal essays we have to pass on to our pastoral colleagues. When I read Nan Shepherd describe her secret place of ease in her manuscript for The Living Mountain, I thought of those pupils who are struggling in their private lives and resolved to show them another side to their writing tasks. Rather than simply something which has to be done for the folio, a personal reflective piece can become just such a place of ease. And so to the final part of my talk, and to other aspects of nature writing in the classroom. I have found that The Living Mountain is an excellent companion to Andrew Gregg's At the Loch of the Green Quarry, probably for advanced higher pupils or an able higher class. Incidentally, thinking about folios again, a writing competition now runs for S5 and S6 pupils in Aberdeenshire called the Nan Shepherd Prize for younger writers, so that could be worth investigating if you're from Aberdeenshire. Kathleen Jamie is also a wonderful option, both in terms of the quality of her writing and the pupil-friendly essay-length pieces in Findings or Sightlines. The autobiographical works of Christopher Rush, John Lister Kay and Jim Crumley work particularly well with National 5 and higher pupils as they have a strong narrative pulse and lend themselves easily to extract selection. Crumley's A High and Lonely Place is also a perfect partner to The Living Mountain, as he takes a different, but still very passionate, approach to writing about the cairngorms. From a trio of male writers to a female one, Linda Cracknell and Amy Liptrot write about place and nature through the lens of trauma, therapy and healing, while Esther Wolfson takes a more traditional approach as an observer of animal and human behaviour. Older texts bring their own challenges and treasures. Gavin Maxwell's Ring of Bright Water, or even further back, John Muir's many autobiographical books. Gaelic literature has its own tradition of nature writing, which has existed since at least the time of Duncan Ban McIntyre. With younger year groups, creative writing can emerge from a study of some well-selected nature writing, such as haibun, which is like haiku, but it's a mixture of poetry and prose. My primary colleagues may also have the good fortune to access forest schools or the John Muir Awards in order to give their pupils real-life experiences to inspire their own nature writing. Scottish nature writing stands at the intersection of so many strands in the Scottish cultural canon. Highland and Lowland, the Enlightenment, the clearances, the diaspora, the Kailyard, Calvinism, nationalism, folk culture. Any study of nature writing at any level will necessarily draw in elements of these strands, informing and enriching one another. It is a rich and varied aspect of Scottish literature which will engage pupils despite the challenges we face in re-engaging many pupils who know very little about their country's environment, its diverse past, its precarious present, and its alarming future. In his book, The Moth Snowstorm, Michael McCarthy writes that humans have an innate ability and desire to connect emotionally, perhaps even spiritually, with nature. He calls it the true haven for our psyches, and I feel sure Nan Shepherd would have agreed with him. McCarthy's optimism is limited. He sees that we can lose this innate need for nature through the modern distractions of jobs, material comfort, and the social parade. Yet he feels that it is possible for us to love it again, to reconnect with the grass and soil and sand we clambered over when we were young, and with the non-human animals that were our childhood friends. Surely this reconnection might start with studying the nature writing of our little part of the planet. Thank you.